Okay, so here we are inside the house, and we're going to take a look and see at some of the framing issues. You can see this house has been stripped from the inside, so we've got a good picture of all the bones of this house. And in fact, I see that it has, like they say, good bones. And so we're going to take a look at how the framing is, how it is structurally, some of the insulation and weatherization issues that we have to be concerned about. But before we go ahead, Arian, tell us some of the things that you're concerned about.
Well, I want to restore the architectural integrity of the house while making it as energy efficient as my budget will allow. So my two big concerns are, one, how do I combat moisture issues, which are obviously a major concern in Southeast Louisiana. So how do I allow the house to breathe while also cutting back on the amount of air leaks, because I don't want astronomical energy bills. In fact, to be honest with you, I want no energy bills.
Zero carbon, right?
Exactly, zero carbon. I want energy to pay me.
Good luck.
Thanks.
So you mentioned a couple of things. You were talking about the weatherization and maybe how do we handle the details behind the wall here. And before we start there, Julie, would you tell us, as a local contractor, you're familiar with the framing techniques that are here. So how's this house framed?
This is balloon framing. So it was designed originally to allow the air to flow behind it because it had plaster.
Okay.
And plaster had all those great qualities that only plaster has. But balloon framing has it open underneath. You can actually put your hand down there and feel underneath your house.
Okay.
Because it's open to it. So that's one of the things you'll have to block that off so that the air and bugs and everything else isn't coming up through the bottom plate, or the lack of a bottom plate.
Okay, so what that brings us to too is how do we make this as a moisture barrier? So we can get in here, we can see, here's the stud, here's the framing, and here's the back side of the cladding, or the weatherboards as we call them. We can see the laps, how they are right here, and we can see they're really tight. One of the concerns we're going to have is water, moisture, rain. It's just going to get onto those boards, and it's going to want to come inside the house. And so we want to find a way to let that drain and dry, right? In the past, we had an open cavity in here that water, moisture could just drain right out. But we want to insulate this because you said yourself you didn't want to pay electric bills, right?
Yeah.
So the only way we can make that happen is either cut off your electricity or insulate the walls. And I'm sure you want to have electricity for cool drinks and things, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a couple different ways to make that happen. In order to insulate the walls, first of all, fiberglass, like we see up here, that fiberglass, we don't want to put it in these walls. And so I would say that down here in New Orleans, don't put fiberglass in the walls. But there's some products, rigid foam insulation, that we can put in the wall here. We can space it off, this exterior cladding, this weatherboarding, say a quarter, half an inch, 3/4 of an inch, with some spacings. In this case, we can use the same rigid foam that we're going to use to create this barrier. So we're going to put a spacer in here, then we're going to put rigid foam in here. That rigid foam has an R value of 5 per inch. So if we put a 1 inch on the wall here, spaced off the wall, we're going to have an R value of 5 right off the bat. And you're way ahead of you ever were before. On top of that, you can add more foam, or you can add spray in, or anything you want inside to get a higher R value. But now we're still going to allow any moisture that gets through into these boards to drain and dry out. And there's going to be ventilation that comes all the way through, right? So it's going to flow all the way through.
Okay. What's a standard R value for the fiberglass insulation? Because 5 doesn't seem like that's so high to me.
It's not very much. Julie, why don't you touch on that?
Typically when you do walls, the R13 is what you're looking for.
Okay.
But it's more about the performance, not just the R value. Because an R value, you know, the fiberglass has a certain R value, but in the wall that you have, it wouldn't perform very well. Because you're going to have a lot of air infiltration through these weatherboards and moisture infiltration that the fiberglass isn't addressing at all. So it's more important to address the moisture and the air infiltration than it is just an R value, because it's not measuring performance of the wall. The air barrier and the foam board that you mentioned is also a great air barrier.
Yes.
When you seal around the edges, you could just stop at that point if you wanted to, depending on your budget. But when you seal around those edges, you've sealed off the air infiltration. You can almost put your hand here on a windy day and feel the air coming through.
Yeah.
So that's what you're trying to guard against. And the air that we have down here is hot and wet. So you don't want that coming into the wall. That's what you're trying to prevent, is that coming into the wall. Not so much just the thermal barrier of having heat come through. It's more the moisture and the hot, wet air coming through.
Exactly.
touch on that right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and I like the way you put that, which is, goes right into the insulation and the air sealing. The other part that's important about this is we can add as much insulation here as you want. It can be spray, it can be rigid. I'm not a big fan of fiberglass at that point. If you had to, you could put it, but don't tell anybody I said that, okay? The other thing about that, Noah, is that we want to maintain ventilation on the other side of that rigid foam. But what we're going to leave then for ventilation is a gap at the top and a gap at the bottom. So for that airflow to go through. So now what that allows, if there's a gap, that means the bugs and the crawlies can get in through there. So there are some products, and that we can show here on the screen as far as in a graphic, that's corrugated plastic with some nylon mesh bug screen that will actually be put at the bottom and the top so that bugs can't crawl through there, but air can still ventilate through that. So we can accomplish all those kinds of things, seal your walls off, and get as much R value as you can afford.